The strange thing about being underestimated is that people stop hiding who they really are. I learned that lesson 3 days after my husband died. The funeral had just ended, and the last guests were drifting out of the church parking lot beneath a gray October sky. I stood quietly beside my black sedan, thanking people for coming, accepting condolences, and trying to ignore the exhaustion that seemed to settle into my bones. My husband, Daniel Whitmore, had been gone for less than a week. 30 years of marriage had ended with a hospital room, a final goodbye, and a silence that still felt impossible to accept. Yet even before the flowers began to wilt, something unexpected started happening. People looked at me differently. Neighbors who had barely spoken to me in years suddenly wore expressions of concern. Distant relatives approached me with careful smiles and sympathetic voices. But it was Daniel's family that caught my attention the most. My mother-in-law, Margaret, wrapped an arm around my shoulders whenever someone important walked by. She kept speaking on my behalf as though I were not standing there. "Claire is going to need all the support she can get," she told one guest. "Daniel handled everything." Later she said it again to another group. "Poor Claire. She has never had to manage these things on her own." I forced a polite smile every time. Not because she was right, but because correcting her would have ruined the performance she seemed determined to give. My brother-in-law Jason was no better. He spent most of the afternoon shaking hands and telling people how the family would rally around me. The way he said it made me sound helpless, fragile, incapable of surviving without guidance. At one point I overheard him speaking near the church entrance. "We will make sure she is taken care of," he said confidently. "The transition is going to be difficult." Several people nodded sympathetically. Nobody asked me what I thought. Nobody seemed interested in whether I needed help at all. By the time we arrived at the reception hall, the assumptions had grown even larger. I sat quietly at a table while Margaret discussed my future as though she were reviewing a business plan. "The house is probably too much for one person," she said. "Downsizing would be practical." Vanessa, Jason's wife, immediately agreed. "Absolutely. Maintaining a property that size costs a fortune." They spoke in soft voices, but not soft enough. Every suggestion carried the same hidden message. They believed I did not understand money. They believed Daniel had protected me from reality. Most of all, they believed that without him, I would soon depend on them. I listened carefully while sipping cold coffee. The more they talked, the more confident they became. It was almost fascinating. They had spent decades assuming Daniel was responsible for everything because he enjoyed being the public face of our success. He attended the events. He gave the interviews. He accepted the praise. I never minded. But now I could see the cost of remaining invisible. Nobody in that room knew the truth. Nobody knew whose signatures appeared on the trust documents. Nobody knew who reviewed every investment, approved every acquisition, and quietly solved every financial crisis that had threatened our future. As the evening drew to a close, Margaret stood near the exit and smiled at me with what looked like genuine concern. Then she delivered the sentence that changed everything. "Don't worry, Claire," she said. "The family will help manage your finances from here." The following afternoon, I received a phone call from Jason asking if he could stop by the house. His tone sounded warm, almost brotherly, and if I had not known him for more than 20 years, I might have believed it was genuine concern. I agreed, and 2 hours later he arrived with Vanessa. They carried a bakery box and a bouquet of flowers, the kind of gestures that look thoughtful from a distance. We sat in the sunroom overlooking the backyard where Daniel and I had spent countless summer evenings. For a few minutes they talked about memories, neighbors, and the unusually cold weather. Then the real reason for their visit finally appeared. Jason leaned forward and folded his hands together. "Claire, I have been thinking about everything that is coming your way," he said. "There are probably a lot of financial matters that need immediate attention." I nodded slowly. "There are certainly things to review." His eyes brightened slightly. "Exactly. Which is why I think it would help if I stepped in temporarily. Just until everything settles down." Vanessa immediately added her support. You should not have to carry that burden alone. It is overwhelming for anyone. I almost smiled. The burden they were discussing had been my responsibility for decades. Yet they spoke as if I had never balanced a checkbook in my life. Jason pulled a folder from his briefcase. I actually put together a preliminary plan. That surprised me. Daniel had been gone less than a week. Apparently the planning had begun much earlier than I realized. Jason opened the folder and started listing recommendations. Review investment accounts. Consolidate assets. Evaluate the property. Consider liquidating unnecessary holdings. The presentation sounded professional until I noticed something interesting. Every proposal would gradually place him closer to decision-making authority. He was not offering help. He was building a path toward control. I listened without interruption. The longer I remained quiet, the more confident he became. By the end of the meeting, he was discussing timelines as though the arrangement had already been approved. Within 6 months, he said, everything should be stabilized. Stabilized. The word lingered in my mind. When they finally left, I walked them to the front door. As they crossed the driveway, Vanessa lowered her voice, apparently believing I had already gone inside. Do you think she understands any of this? She asked. Jason laughed softly. Not a chance. Daniel handled everything important. She will need us before long. Their car disappeared around the corner while I remained standing on the porch. For a moment I felt something close to disappointment. Not anger. Not yet. Just disappointment. After all these years, they truly believed I was incapable. That evening, I sat alone in Daniel's home office and opened a secure file stored on my laptop. A complete record of every family trust, investment account, and financial structure appeared. On the screen, names, balances, distributions, and decades of transactions filled the pages. One section immediately caught my attention. Several recurring transfers connected directly to benefits enjoyed by members of Daniel's family. Vacation properties. Educational accounts. Business assistance. Monthly support arrangements. The numbers were far larger than most people would imagine. I reviewed the records for nearly 3 hours before closing the computer. Then I noticed an unread message that had arrived from our attorney earlier that afternoon. The subject line contained only 6 words. You should see this immediately. I opened the message expecting another routine update from our attorney, but what I found immediately pulled me back more than 30 years. Attached to the email was a scanned copy of a handwritten letter Daniel had left in the firm's secure records. The instructions were clear. The letter was only to be released if he passed away before making certain changes to our estate plan. I stared at his familiar handwriting for several seconds before I could bring myself to read it. The first line made me smile despite everything. If you are reading this, then I was right about one thing. You always insist on handling the hard parts yourself. I could almost hear his voice. As I continued reading, memories I had not visited in years began returning. Long before the lake house, the investment accounts, and the comfortable life everyone associated with the Whitmore name, Daniel and I lived in a 1-bedroom apartment above a hardware store. The ceiling leaked when it rained. The heating system worked only when it wanted to. We counted every dollar. Back then, Daniel had ambition and charisma. People liked him immediately. Investors listened when he spoke. Clients trusted him. He could walk into a room full of strangers and leave with 3 new opportunities before lunch. What most people never saw was what happened after those meetings ended. Every evening, I sat at a small kitchen table covered with notebooks, receipts, and financial reports. While Daniel built relationships, I built systems. While he pitched ideas, I calculated risks. While he traveled, I negotiated financing, reviewed contracts, and tracked every expense. We were a team, and neither of us pretended otherwise. In fact, Daniel used to joke that he was the face of the business while I was the engine. Somewhere along the way, the world stopped noticing the engine. Success arrived gradually. 1 investment became 3. 3 became 10. A small consulting partnership expanded into multiple holdings. Then came real estate acquisitions, private investments, and eventually the trusts that would support future generations of our family. The public saw Daniel accepting awards and giving interviews. I preferred remaining behind the scenes. It seemed simpler that way. For years, that arrangement worked perfectly. Until people began assuming visibility meant ownership. By the time Jason entered the family business environment as a young man, he already believed the entire Whitmore success story belonged to Daniel alone. Margaret encouraged that belief. So did almost everyone else. I never corrected them. At first, it felt unnecessary. Then it became convenient. Eventually it became invisible. Daniel understood exactly what was happening, but neither of us cared enough to fight it. Reading his letter, I realized he had noticed something else as well. Near the end of the document, he wrote a sentence that made me stop cold. If my family ever mistakes your kindness for dependence, they will eventually reveal who they truly are. I leaned back in my chair and stared through the office window into the dark backyard. The attorney had included one final note beneath the attachment. A meeting had been scheduled for the following week to review estate matters. Several family members had already contacted the firm requesting information about distributions and asset transfers. That alone was not unusual. What was unusual was the final sentence. According to the attorney, someone had attempted to gain access to financial records they were never authorized to see. The next morning, I arrived at the office building that housed several of our private entities before most employees had even started their day. The security guard greeted me by name and held the door open with the same quiet respect he had shown for years. As the elevator climbed toward the executive floor, I found myself thinking about the attorney's warning. Someone had tried to access information that did not belong to them. The question was not who. The question was why they felt entitled to it. Once inside my office, I began reviewing records that stretched back nearly 2 decades. The deeper I looked, the clearer the picture became. The first discovery involved the lake house Jason loved to show off every summer. Family members often referred to it as part of the Whitmore legacy. According to the records, however, the property had never belonged to Daniel personally. It was owned through a trust structure that I had established years earlier. Every maintenance payment, property tax bill, renovation expense, and insurance premium had been approved through accounts under my direct authority. Next came the educational funds. Jason's 2 children had attended prestigious universities without accumulating significant student debt. Margaret frequently told friends how proud she was that the family had always taken care of its own. What she never knew was that the tuition distributions originated from trusts I personally supervised. Then I reached a file labeled Emergency Assistance. I opened it and stared at the screen for several moments. 7 years earlier, Jason's business had faced a severe financial crisis. Publicly, he credited his recovery to smart decision-making and perseverance. Privately, a substantial capital injection had prevented the entire venture from collapsing. The funds had originated from one of our family investment entities. An entity I controlled. The pattern repeated again and again. Vacation expenses. Mortgage assistance. Business consulting arrangements. Medical support during difficult periods. Every road seemed to lead back to decisions I had made behind the scenes. None of this bothered me. Daniel and I had always believed that success meant helping the people we loved. What unsettled me was the growing realization that many of those same people now viewed me as a burden rather than a benefactor. Shortly after noon, my phone rang. It was Margaret. Her voice sounded unusually cheerful. She asked how I was doing, whether I was eating properly, whether I needed anything. Then, almost casually, she mentioned that Jason was preparing a list of financial recommendations for me. Apparently he was investing significant time into organizing my future. I thanked her politely and listened while she praised his generosity. After the call ended, I sat quietly for several minutes. The irony was almost impossible to ignore. The people discussing how to manage my affairs were unknowingly benefiting from financial arrangements that existed because of my decisions. Yet they continued speaking about me as though I were incapable of managing my own life. Later that evening, Another message arrived from the attorney. The family meeting regarding the estate had been officially scheduled. Everyone would be present. Lawyers, advisors, relatives, and trustees. At the bottom of the message was a short note that immediately captured my attention. Several attendees had already submitted questions in advance. One particular question appeared more than once. They wanted to know how soon distributions would begin after the estate review was completed. Over the next several days, I made a deliberate decision to do nothing. I did not confront anyone. I did not correct their assumptions. Most importantly, I did not interfere as members of Daniel's family became increasingly comfortable revealing exactly what they expected to happen once the estate review was complete. It started with small comments. During a lunch invitation, Vanessa casually mentioned that she had been delaying a luxury kitchen renovation because it made sense to wait until everything settled. The way she said it suggested she already viewed future money as a certainty. A few days later, Margaret called to discuss family matters and somehow managed to spend 20 minutes describing repairs she wanted to make to her vacation property. She spoke as though funding would appear automatically. At no point did she ask whether those resources actually existed. She simply assumed they did. The most revealing conversation happened 3 days before the estate meeting. Jason invited me to dinner at a country club he frequently visited. Throughout the meal, he continued presenting himself as a concerned relative trying to help a grieving widow navigate difficult circumstances. Yet beneath the sympathetic language, I could see something else. He repeatedly steered the discussion toward assets, distributions, timelines, and future decisions. Eventually he leaned back in his chair and asked a question that seemed innocent on the surface. "Have the attorneys given you any indication how quickly everything will be finalized?" I looked at him carefully before answering. "No." "Why do you ask?" He shrugged. "Just planning ahead." Planning ahead. The phrase stayed with me long after dinner ended. The following morning, another report arrived from the attorney's office. Because I served as a controlling trustee on several entities, I was authorized to receive updates regarding inquiries connected to the estate. Reading through the notes felt like watching a puzzle assemble itself. Jason had contacted advisors asking procedural questions. Vanessa had requested information regarding potential distribution schedules. Margaret had inquired about family benefits connected to several trusts. None of these actions violated any rules. What mattered was the pattern. Their attention was focused almost entirely on receiving. Nobody seemed concerned about preserving. Nobody asked how structures functioned. Nobody questioned where resources originated. They simply expected access. That afternoon, I reviewed several years of financial records one final time. The numbers told a story no one in the family understood. Some support arrangements were discretionary. Others depended on trustee approval. Several programs existed solely because Daniel and I had chosen generosity over convenience. Without active authorization, many of those benefits could disappear. For the first time, I began to understand why Daniel had written that letter. He had anticipated exactly what was happening. He knew kindness often becomes invisible when it lasts long enough. People stop seeing it as a gift and start viewing it as an entitlement. The evening before the estate meeting, I sat alone in the library at home and reviewed the official agenda. Lawyers, trustees, financial advisors, family members. Everything appeared routine until I reached the final section. Attached to the agenda was an additional document scheduled for presentation after the primary estate review concluded. I had seen it before, but most attendees had not. The title alone was enough to change everything. It was a complete historical accounting of every financial benefit extended to members of the Whitmore family over the past 20 years. The estate meeting took place on a rainy Thursday morning in a conference room overlooking downtown Chicago. By the time I arrived, most of the family was already there. Margaret sat near the head of the table speaking quietly with Vanessa. Jason stood beside the windows checking messages on his phone. The attorneys and financial advisors were arranging documents into neat stacks. The atmosphere felt surprisingly relaxed for a room supposedly gathered to discuss the future of a man who had only recently passed away. As I took my seat, I noticed something else. People were smiling. Not broadly, not openly, but with the kind of confidence that appears when someone believes they already know how the story ends. The meeting began with routine legal matters. The lead attorney reviewed procedural requirements, confirmed identities, and explained how the estate review would proceed. Everyone listened patiently. Then came discussions about Daniel's personal assets, charitable commitments, and existing obligations. Nothing seemed unusual. Jason remained calm. Margaret appeared almost relieved. Vanessa occasionally exchanged glances with her husband. I suspected they were waiting for the same thing. The distributions. The transfers. The moment when expectations would become reality. Nearly an hour passed before the attorney reached a section labeled Governance and Trustee Authority. His tone changed slightly. The room became quieter. He explained that many family assets were not owned directly by individuals but operated through layered trust structures established over many years. Most attendees nodded politely, clearly uninterested in technical details. Then the attorney read the next paragraph. Several trusts supporting family programs, educational funds, property maintenance arrangements, and long-term investments would continue operating under their existing management framework. There was nothing surprising about that statement. The surprise arrived with the next sentence. Effective immediately, all final decision-making authority regarding those structures rested with the sole controlling trustee. I watched Jason straighten in his chair. Margaret looked toward the attorney. Vanessa stopped taking notes. The attorney calmly continued. The sole controlling trustee was Claire Whitmore. For several seconds nobody spoke. The silence felt almost physical. Jason blinked twice as though he had misheard something. Margaret leaned forward. There must be some mistake, she said carefully. The attorney shook his head. There is no mistake. He slid several documents across the table. These structures have operated under Mrs. Whitmore's authority for many years. The expressions around the room changed instantly. Confusion replaced confidence. Vanessa looked toward her husband. Jason began reviewing pages with increasing urgency. The more he read, the less comfortable he appeared. The attorney continued explaining responsibilities, oversight powers, approval rights, and governance procedures. Every explanation produced the same result. Control did not belong to Jason. It did not belong to Margaret. It did not belong to anyone they had expected. It belonged to me. Throughout the presentation, I said almost nothing. I simply listened while years of assumptions slowly collapsed under the weight of documented facts. Yet the most significant revelation had not even arrived. Near the end of the review, the attorney closed one folder and opened another. Several family members appeared exhausted already. They believed the shock was over. They were wrong. The attorney adjusted his glasses, glanced around the room, and introduced the final scheduled document. It was the historical accounting report that detailed exactly where family support funding had originated for the past 2 decades. The attorney distributed copies of the report to everyone seated at the table. At first, nobody seemed particularly concerned. Margaret adjusted her glasses and began reading. Jason flipped through several pages with the confidence of someone expecting confirmation rather than revelation. Vanessa glanced down casually. Then the room grew noticeably quieter. The report was not a summary. It was a detailed accounting of financial support provided to various members of the family over the previous 20 years. Every property subsidy, educational payment, business assistance package, maintenance allocation, and discretionary distribution was listed with dates, amounts, and funding sources. The first sign of trouble appeared when Jason stopped turning pages. His eyes remained fixed on a single section. The confidence I had seen all morning disappeared. He looked back at the previous page and then forward again, as if hoping the numbers would somehow change. Margaret's expression followed a similar path. Confusion became disbelief. Disbelief slowly became discomfort. The attorney calmly explained that the purpose of the report was transparency. Daniel had specifically requested that all beneficiaries understand the origin and structure of family support programs. No one interrupted him. For the first time since the meeting began, nobody seemed eager to speak. The report revealed that the Lake House Maintenance Fund originated from a trust under my authority. The educational accounts used by Jason's children had been funded through distributions I approved. The emergency capital that saved Jason's business years earlier had been authorized through one of the entities I managed. Even several charitable donations that Margaret often referenced as examples of the family's generosity had originated from structures Daniel and I established together. The deeper they read, the more uncomfortable the atmosphere became. Vanessa finally broke the silence. "There has to be some misunderstanding," she said softly. "Daniel handled these things." The attorney shook his head. "Mr. Whitmore participated extensively, but approval authority for many of these programs belonged to Mrs. Whitmore." Nobody responded. Jason continued reading. His face had turned pale. Several pages later, he reached the section documenting assistance provided to his own company. The amount was significant. Much larger than most people in the room expected. He stared at the figure for several seconds before looking toward me. For years, he had spoken publicly about overcoming adversity through determination and strategic decision-making. Now he was discovering that the crisis which nearly destroyed his business had been resolved because someone he considered financially dependent had quietly intervened behind the scenes. Margaret lowered her report and looked directly at me. There was no anger in her expression. Not yet. What I saw instead was something closer to confusion. She was trying to reconcile two completely different versions of reality. The widow she believed needed guidance was apparently the same person responsible for maintaining many of the benefits the family had enjoyed for decades. The attorney allowed everyone time to absorb the information before continuing. Then he introduced one final section of the report. Unlike the previous pages, this portion focused on future administration. Several discretionary programs would soon require review and renewal. Existing support arrangements were not automatically permanent. Continuing them would depend on trustee evaluation and approval. The attorney paused before delivering the sentence that changed the mood of the entire room. Effective immediately, every future decision regarding those programs rested solely with me. For several long seconds, nobody said anything. The attorney's final statement seemed to settle over the room like a weight nobody knew how to lift. Every future decision rested with me. Not with Jason. Not with Margaret. Not with any committee or advisory board. Me. The same woman they had spent the past 2 weeks discussing as though she were incapable of managing her own affairs. Jason was the first to recover. He cleared his throat and attempted a smile that never quite formed. "Well," he said, "obviously everyone appreciates everything you and Daniel have done over the years." The sudden shift in tone was impossible to miss. Just days earlier he had been offering to supervise my finances. Now he was speaking as though we had always been equal partners. Margaret looked between us. "Claire, surely nothing needs to change," she said carefully. "The family has always supported one another." I almost admired the wording. It avoided acknowledging what the documents had just revealed. The family had benefited from support, certainly. But the direction of that support had not been what they believed. The attorney continued reviewing the report. Several advisors answered technical questions while additional schedules were distributed around the table. One chart showed 20 years of assistance programs. Another outlined trust performance and contribution histories. The further the discussion progressed, the more difficult it became for anyone to maintain old assumptions. Every major support structure traced back to decisions Daniel and I had made together. Every significant benefit depended upon systems we had created. What surprised me most was not the information itself. I had known these facts for years. What surprised me was watching people confront a reality they had never bothered to question. Vanessa slowly closed her folder and folded her hands. For the first time since the meeting began, she looked genuinely embarrassed. Margaret appeared exhausted. Jason remained focused on the numbers, repeatedly reviewing sections that documented assistance provided to his business. Eventually, one of the financial advisors asked whether there were any additional questions regarding the historical report. No one answered immediately. Then Jason spoke. How much of this remains active? The attorney glanced toward me before responding. Several programs are currently scheduled for review. Their continuation depends on trustee evaluation. Again, the room fell silent. Everyone understood exactly what that meant. The conversation was no longer about inheritance. It was about dependency. People who believed they were discussing future benefits were suddenly forced to consider the possibility of losing existing ones. I remained quiet. Not because I enjoyed their discomfort, but because there was nothing left to explain. The documents were doing that work for me. Near the end of the meeting, the attorney opened one final envelope that had been prepared years earlier. Inside was a brief personal statement from Daniel. The room listened as his words were read aloud. He expressed gratitude for family, appreciation for loyalty, and hope for future unity. Then came his final observation. He wrote that true character is revealed not by what people receive, but by how they treat those they believe have nothing left to offer. When the reading ended, nobody looked at me. They could not. Because for the first time, everyone in that room understood exactly what Daniel had known all along. When the meeting finally ended, people gathered their documents much more slowly than they had arrived. The confidence that had filled the room that morning was gone. Conversations were quieter. Movements were cautious. Nobody seemed entirely certain what to say next. I remained seated for a few moments after everyone began standing. Through the large windows, I could see the rain had stopped and sunlight was beginning to break through the clouds. It felt strangely appropriate. For weeks, I had watched assumptions grow stronger. I had listened as people discussed my future without asking my opinion. I had heard plans, recommendations, and predictions about what would happen to me after Daniel was gone. Now the truth was sitting in front of everyone, documented in black and white. As family members slowly exited the conference room, Margaret approached me first. She looked older than she had a few hours earlier. "Claire," she said quietly, "I did not know." I believed her. The problem was that she had never cared enough to ask. I offered a small nod. "I know." She seemed to search for additional words but could not find them. After a moment, she walked away. Vanessa stopped briefly as well. Her apology was sincere, though uncomfortable. She admitted she had made assumptions. She admitted she had followed Jason's lead. I appreciated her honesty, even if it came late. Then Jason approached. For the first time in many years, he looked uncertain. Gone was the confidence of the man who thought he understood every financial decision surrounding the family. Gone was the certainty that he would eventually guide my future. "Claire," he began, "I think there has been a misunderstanding between all of us." I almost smiled. A misunderstanding suggests two people failed to communicate. This had been something else entirely. "No," I replied calmly. "There was an assumption." He looked down without arguing. Neither of us needed to say more. The documents had already settled the matter. Before leaving, I met privately with the attorneys and advisors. Several support programs were scheduled for review over the coming months. I made my decisions carefully. Educational funds for younger family members would continue. Charitable commitments Daniel cared about would remain active. Certain family assistance programs would also continue, but under revised guidelines designed to encourage responsibility rather than dependency. My goal was never punishment. Daniel and I had not spent decades building opportunities simply to destroy them. What changed was something far more important. The era of entitlement was over. Respect, accountability, and transparency would now accompany every benefit. Later that evening, I returned home alone. The house felt quiet, but not empty. For the first time since Daniel's passing, I felt something other than grief. I felt clarity. I walked into his office and looked at the framed photograph sitting on the bookshelf. It had been taken years earlier during one of our first successful ventures. We were young, exhausted, and smiling like two people who believed anything was possible. In many ways, we had been right. You saw this coming, I said softly. And somehow I think he did. The greatest lesson Daniel left behind was not about money, investments, or wealth. It was about character. People reveal who they are when they believe you have lost your value. Some offer kindness. Some offer respect. Others reveal ambition disguised as concern. As for me, I no longer needed anyone's permission to be seen. I picked up my keys, turned off the office light, and walked forward into the next chapter of my life, carrying the one thing nobody could ever take away from me, the truth.